to our podcast. My name is Samuel Fitzpatrick, host and director, and this is our guest, Mason Christensen. Before we dive into the podcast, we just finished getting a tour of the multiple buildings of the Dearborn Historical Society, including the military garrison and the office buildings and archives. So before we dive into it again, I'm going to turn the mic over to you to kind of give us a little background on you, where you live, what you do, where you work, etc.
I am Mason Christensen. I've worked here for about 3 years at the Dearborn Historical Museum. I'm originally from the Lansing area. Grew up on kind of the west side of the city there. And I came here to Dearborn because, like everybody in the history field, I was eager to work in an interesting place with dynamic history. And when I saw an opportunity to work here, I kind of jumped at the chance. So today at the museum, I basically work with paper collections, I work with documents, I give tours, I help out with events and the like.
Okay. So tell us about a brief history of Dearborn. I know it goes back to the early 19th century, a little sooner maybe.
Older than that even.
Okay. Let's start there.
Okay, so, Dearborn is, it's... Technically, you had people as far back as the 1780s. Actually, on our city seal, we use this whole settled in 1786 date. And it's because, basically, you had these French Canadians that as Detroit got bigger and they started running out of nice land along the Detroit River, they started really settling in this area along the Rouge River. You had people kind of gradually coming up from what is now like Delray in Detroit, gradually settling, getting these nice long French farm lots along the river. They were primitive farms. You had little log cabins. But today, when people come into Dearborn, sometimes they're really confused by our street pattern. They'll see these kind of weird diagonal streets in the city. And it's because a lot of these streets are kind of following the old French farm lot boundaries. I live near Monroe Street in Dearborn, and Monroe Street is another one of those ones that is just kind of goes at a weird diagonal angle. And it was because it was on the boundary of the Sisney farm claim. It's the reason why it is that case. Basically, moving on, you had those French settlers, as the area became American, they kind of merged into the landscape. You had some of them eventually moved to Canada. It was kind of stagnant for a while. Basically, when the Erie Canal was built, connecting settlers from New York State, suddenly a lot more people came into the area. And then when you got to about 1832, the U.S. Army came by and basically, went to what is now the west side of the city, Dearborn, and saw that there was this nice hilly land that, they happened to already own thanks to a prior, acquisition. They came here, saw, access to the river. It was nice hilly ground, and they decided, we want to build a new base here. Basically, they built a facility called the Detroit Arsenal. It replaced an older facility in Detroit, roughly near Cobo Hall, in that area. And it was basically there to help supply the Army, but also serve as a nice rallying point in case of bad things bad things, basically. You had the British in Canada. Canada was still a British colony. There was, this was 20 years. They're here in the the Army's coming here in the 1830s. And this is only 20 years after the War of 1812 when the British invaded Michigan. And
Wounds are still fresh. Veterans are still around. It's not out of the question that the British could come across the river again.
Exactly. You're right there on the Canadian border, and there's a threat that the British are going to come again. And so the Army wants to build new facilities, and the Detroit Arsenal in Dearborn is one of several to get built. You have there's a barracks that's set up in Detroit about the same time. And only a few years later, if people have heard of Fort Wayne in Detroit, Fort Wayne in Detroit is built in 1841, and it's basically built for the same reasons. It's there to effectively guard the Canadian border, pretty much. You also, because the arsenal here is built on Michigan Avenue, and very shortly afterwards, the Michigan Central Railroad linking Detroit and Chicago gets built through. It's partly there to serve, if there's a Native American war out west, it's there to help soldiers, supply soldiers who are heading off to the front somewhere. In the American Civil War, the base is used, to help supply Michigan regiments who are going off to fight the Confederates. So this arsenal is built. Then you have one of the first commanders of the base, a guy named Joshua Howard, basically decides he likes the land in the area. He's the one, he gets out of the Army, decides, I'm going to build a little town nearby. Joshua Howard is kind of the founding father of the city. He's a big fan of a guy who was a general of the U.S. Army named Henry Dearborn. And this little town that he creates, he names after this guy, Henry Dearborn. It's how you get the name Dearborn. So this village is going on for about, roughly 80 years. It's effectively a military garrison town. The base closes in 1875. But for another 40 years, you get into the 1910s, and it's a very stagnant town.
Okay.
It's not. There's not a lot going on. It's you have farmer. The city is effectively serving farmers. It's it's a town that's only maybe 1,000 people are here. Just about any county seat in the state at the time is bigger. It's places like Wayne, Michigan. It's a suburb just down the road is a bigger community. You have it's the arsenal was what this town was basically. The economy is based upon this town. And this town was based upon the arsenal, and it's when the arsenal closes, it's devastating to the economy, and the city doesn't really recover until Henry Ford comes around.
So it was a pretty quiet, not totally desolate place, but just kind of
pretty much. I mean, that's
nothing you'd go out of your way to see. Nothing.
Yeah.
No real attractions yet. Just kind of it's there.
Yes, I mean it will take the later influence of Henry Ford to really make it into a bigger city.
Okay. Okay. So while we're on the topic of the military garrison here, it's now a museum. Let's talk about the history of the museum, maybe some cool artifacts you want to talk about, exhibits, or
sure,
what your daily life is here like as a worker.
Let me go into a little more detail about the arsenal first. I mean, the arsenal, it was a whole complex covering this whole west side of the city. It's roughly, it went from about Mason Street all the way over to Oakwood Street, covering a couple square blocks in the center of what is now the west downtown Dearborn. It's basically, let's put it this way, west downtown Dearborn is built around the arsenal. Maps of this area say the arsenal grounds, where the arsenal was, and these buildings, most of the buildings eventually, the buildings were used as a supply base, and when the base closed down, it went through various uses, before they became the museum. A lot of them are, one near our commandant's quarters building, which was the commander's house, was it originally, the building across the street was called the gun carriage shed, and when it was during the base, it was it fixed artillery, basically. When the base closed, it becomes a Masonic hall, and the Masons ended up adding a second story to it. You get into like the 1910s, and it becomes a movie theater, and it gets added onto, and then it becomes eventually becomes a Kinzel drugstore. I think at one point, it becomes a location like the annex for this place called Dearborn Music that still exists actually. And then eventually Dearborn Music moves to a different location, and it becomes now an Italian pastry shop. You have all these other buildings that have interesting uses, like the blacksmith shop and the carpenter shop, which are also part of the base. That, obviously, if your horses need, shoes, you have blacksmiths working there to do it. And when the base closes, that building eventually, those two buildings get linked up, the blacksmith and carpenter shop, and turn into an automobile factory. I find that kind of cool. You have this company called the Detroit Dearborn Automobile Company that is housed in those two buildings. And yeah, they're one of those companies that's kind of demolished by Ford when Ford really gets out with the Model T. One of those many local companies out there that are kind of demolished. Other buildings, you have like the surgeons' quarters and kind of regular soldiers' barracks that are unfortunately torn down for Dearborn High School. And it's kind of this interesting evolution of these different sites. Then there's the main building that was referred to as the Armoury, was torn down. Actually, no, it burned down. Sorry, it burned down in 1910 after it was converted into a factory. At one point, it was also a theater building as well. It that's a real tragedy. There's so many great pictures of that building. It annoys me that it burned down, but it was such a big spectacular fire. And it attracted people from Detroit, took the train to come out and see the fire. I mean, it was this big, impressive complex that used to be here. It's in some respects, it's why we exist as a museum originally back when we were created in 1950 to memorialize this history, because it was a fairly impressive looking base. The buildings that are here that we still have, and along with the buildings that were destroyed, used local brick here in the area. You had this whole brick industry. That was here in Dearborn back to the 1820s, and existing as recently as the 1970s, that used local clay from basically glacial lake sediments here, and it was really good clay. And basically, the local brick makers are able to use this clay to make really nice looking buildings here. Places. If you look at our main building, the Commandant's Quarters. It's one of the things that people most admire is the brickwork of the building. And you go there, and it's the reason why some of these buildings still exist, just because the brickwork is so beautiful. The Commandant's Quarters is one that after the base closes and it stops being the base's commander's house, it becomes a school. We have photos of like school children out front. You have other buildings. You have it become a fire station, a police, just out back. You have a police station in there. It's a long laundry list of building uses that happened for that one. There's a structure out back that was the sutler's shop that was it was a shop for merchants. Basically, that later gets converted into a doctor's office. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting evolution to the complex overall. So most of those buildings are long gone by the 20th century. The ones I told you about that were that became the car factory end up getting torn down in the 1940s, sadly. They get turned into a whole restaurant that gets built in Dearborn Heights called the Military Inn, that the guy basically salvaged the bricks, built a castle out of it, and used it to store and showcase his fancy gun collection, along with selling really good food. Unfortunately, that got torn down as well. I'm just bummed out about that. I know. I mean, it's just so much stuff. These buildings had such a long history. The Commandant's Quarters, going back to the Commandant's Quarters, that ends up becoming kind of the Dearborn City Hall. Then, eventually the current City Hall gets built on the east side of the city, and it becomes just simply a police station. And it's, eventually, after a while, then it finally becomes our museum. Around 1950, the Dearborn Historical Commission takes over it. You have this big celebration of a festival called the Cavalcade of Dearborn.
Mm-hmm. This is in 1950?
Yes.
Okay.
That dedicates this museum. And, it's this big party that we have all these parade photos showing it. The mayor of Dearborn's out there and other dignitaries are out there. And it dedicates, the Commandant's Quarters as the Dearborn Historical Museum. This building that you're in now, the McFadden Ross House, is another one related to the arsenal in that it's the former powder magazine of the Army base. It was a few blocks away here on Brady Street, mostly because you didn't want, in case the gunpowder that was stored here, exploded, you didn't want it to hurt anybody over at the main Army base. This basically the powder magazine here, while like the rest of the base, like the Commandant's Quarters, was built mostly around 1833 to 35. This was built more toward 1839. There was a lot of red tape in getting a powder magazine built out here. The Army, for some reason, was not approving taking all their gunpowder stocks out of the middle of Detroit to Dearborn. And so it took a long time for the Army commander to get the magazine built out here. He got it built. It took like a year to dry out the insides of it so that it was a good place to store gunpowder. And finally, gunpowder stored here. So until the base closes in 1875, it's just storing gunpowder stocks. Nobody's regularly serving here. And the funny thing is, like, we have, the museum has ghost hunters that occasionally come to this house. And, they claim...
You did mention earlier in some conversations that you yourself have not seen anything, but you've heard stories. Before we go into that, I believe in the paranormal. I have an open mind to that. Do you believe in the paranormal at all?
I think it's possible, but okay. I think that the problem with, some buildings is that, like here, I'm mentioning it because for a good, 35 plus years, this is just storing gunpowder. You may have a sentry outside. That's it. And the thing is...
So the chances of this being haunted from someone from that period is low because it was just not...
No, nobody's going to be here at all.
Right.
Like, that's just it. And the thing is, when the base closes, this turns into a house. It was the Ross family that acquired it. And basically, the Rosses were here from about 1883 when they acquired the Powder magazine, which was effectively government surplus. They were here until about 1950, and it's just them. It's, the parents, Nathaniel and Elizabeth, are living here. Then eventually their children, Lizzie and Lytle Ross, are living here. They're not having a ton of children. And the thing is, this house had a surprising number of bedrooms, but for the most part, after the parents Nathaniel and Elizabeth are gone, they may have one or two people renting rooms. There's a few people, occasionally, Lizzie would adopt a child or, have a foster child and have them here. But you don't ever have a lot of people here, despite there being a huge number of bedrooms in this house. And so the thing is, like, in reality, unless, like, everybody who ever lived here is a haunted spirit in this house, you shouldn't be running across anything. Mm-hmm. Basically. Like I said, there very well could be spirits in the world, but I just don't, you shouldn't be coming across much in this house. So
have ghost crews, you said that they've come through here and investigated, have they found anything? Have they claimed to have found anything? Or is it...
Yeah, I mean, they believe they found some stuff here, but it's, we have more ghost crews coming in. But like I said, if you're going to find something, it's going to be over the Commandant's quarters, because I told you about all the different uses over there. The Commandant's quarters has this long storied history as a building, because it's been through, everything from being the commander's house to the military base to, being a city hall at one point to, where guys were actually jailed. Like, you actually had jail cells in the city hall in the basement, during that period up through the present. You have this long history. This house is a bit different, and it basically became part of the museum because you had this fully functional farm complex here. We have an office building across the parking lot from this that is on the site of where there were a series of barns. So when the museum acquired this, the museum had barns. They had farm equipment. They had wagons. They had all sorts of interesting collections. And the Rosses just left us huge amount of items. They just left us all sorts of great stuff. They kind of left us the core of the museum's collection. The biggest, by far originally the biggest portion of our collection was items that they left us. And we have pictures of when it, was given to the museum, the house, that show effectively rooms that were, hoarders' dens. Like up here in what's now the archives in the upstairs, there's piles of trash, there's lampshades, there's other random stuff that was just piled around. And so it was kind of a mess, put it that way. And it took years, and they did a lot of work in this house. They changed the layout of some of the rooms. They converted a few of the old bedrooms in this house to a meeting room. And it's kind of, like I said, it's interesting all the work they did.
Okay, I'm going to sort of switch gears here. We're going to stay on the topic of the museum. Sure. I want to talk about what sort of educational programs you guys provide, any current or upcoming exhibits, community outreach, or any programs that you do for the local Dearborn community. Just kind of talk about that for a bit.
Basically, educationally wise, we get about 1,500 second graders here from Dearborn Public Schools from all over the city.
It's just the second graders?
Just second graders. We don't, unfortunately, we only have about 6 staff members here.
Okay.
Not, in addition to our volunteers, it's just not enough staff to do much more than that. They're from all over the city, from all the different elementary schools here. And as Dearborn Public Schools is a huge district, just getting second graders alone is kind of a chore at times. And this year is going to be a lot of work getting them through the museum. And they come here and they do a lot of fun stuff. They get to make butter. They get to plant seeds. They get to basically, they get to learn about kind of old farm chores like lifting pails of water, into the house, over there in the Gardner house. They get to do math. They get to do kind of classroom exercises. They get to, do math problems. They get to read things out of textbooks. It's interesting all they get to do, and it's interesting seeing their reaction because Dearborn Public Schools is very diverse. Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting district in general because you go from on the east side of the city today, you have kids who are recent immigrants from, say, Yemen or from Jordan or from Iraq. And you have families that are from, families that they may be second or third generation from Lebanon, who they've grown up here in Dearborn, but they still have, they still have maybe some conservative family members. And then you have here on the west side of the city, you may have your normal Canadian immigrant family, grandparents came from Canada, moved here and or just, Italian families or wherever, or what, your classroom that resembles any classroom in rural areas in Michigan or somewhere like that. And it's interesting variety of ethnicities and groups and populations and politics, and it's, you see that with all the different schools that are represented in the school program, it's very interesting, and it leads to some of these school kids have different reactions to some of the materials, and it's you always pay attention to which school is coming. Mm-hmm. We know sometimes that, for example, in Ramadan this year is coming up this spring, and it's sometimes when we have Salina School, which is on the southeast end of the city, that in the middle of Ramadan, if it's that time of year that they're coming, we may not get as high of attendance from that part of the city. So it's for a field trip. Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So it's one thing you pay attention for, like a morning field trip that when they come in. Overall, we do what we can to reach the city and educationally. We do a fair amount of active social media. I post a lot on our Facebook page, Twitter. I try to get some occasionally on Instagram as well. We scan a lot of documents here at the archives, here at the museum. We have hundreds of thousands of photos, hundreds and hundreds of thousands. It's
emphasis on.
I mean, the only museum I know, and the only museum, or I should say archive I know, other than ones in Detroit, that have more than us is Grand Rapids. I would say I've talked to some of the archivists at the Grand Rapids Public Library who say their photo collection is more in the millions.
Wow.
Thanks to Negative and other photo. Okay. Photos.
What about Detroit?
Yeah, Detroit. The one place that would have more than us is Detroit and Grand Rapids. Okay. I would say maybe Lansing might have a little bit.
Historical archives.
Well, I mean, Capital Area District and Library has a fair amount, but I think for the most part, I think we may have more than Lansing even for covering the city of Lansing.
Wow.
And it's because there's just the city's taken huge amounts of photographs over time, and it's that kind of stuff. That's why we try to be a little bit active on social media. We try to, because we have so much to work with, and there's so many photos to go through, and part of it, the problem occasionally sometimes is some of the photos are all of the same topic. Mm-hmm. There's this place, Camp Dearborn, that everybody goes to. Everybody used to go to, not as much these days. It was this recreation facility in Oakland County. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of photos of Camp Dearborn. Thousands. We have dozens of old brochures. We have like swimsuit tags and random certificates, and it's it's amazing what we have just for stuff like that.
Real quick, I just want to back up a little bit. You mentioned that you post a lot on social media for the Historic Society. For those that are listening or watching, if you guys are interested, where can people find out more about the Historical Society Museum here?
Well, I mean, we have our website, thedhm.org. There's also our Facebook page, Dearborn Historical Museum.
Okay.
By the way, the Historical Society is actually a different organization than us.
I misspoke, sorry.
Yeah. But yeah, the Historical Museum, we are actually a city-run agency.
Okay.
So we serve, it's under the Historical Commission, but we are an agency of the city of Dearborn. We do what we can to serve the community. The problem sometimes is that we are here in the west side of the city, and if you drive around, you'll notice that the west side and the east side of the city are very different. Because at one point, this is over here in the west side of the city is the old community of Dearborn associated with the Arsenal. The east side of the city was a separate community that popped up next to the Fort Rouge plant. And it's basically today, yes, they are culturally very different. Even, say, 60 years ago, you had different ethnicities in different parts of the city. And so they've kind of culturally behaved differently. And we have trouble sometimes reaching that kind of market. Because a lot of our old-time volunteers, the people who worked here who donated stuff, are from this side of town. In some respects, we have an easier time getting donations and volunteers from people in Dearborn Heights than we do from the east side of the city. Because we're often, in some respects, just geographically as a museum, we're closer to Dearborn Heights than we are to the east side of the city. But we serve as this destination. If you're doing, family, number one, like here at the archives, we serve as like a destination for family history research and house research. And the object side of things, we basically try to serve as a place that keeps memories of institutions alive. We try to, because the Henry Ford Museum exists to talk about Ford and all those other companies, we want to really try to preserve the memories of things like the institutions that they're going to, the businesses that they're visiting, the schools that they went to, things like that. Because the Henry Ford Museum is not really, it's preserving the story of the place where Dearbornites worked. It's not preserving the memory of the places where Dearbornites shopped. It's not preserving the memory of the places where Dearbornites actually lived. It's not, places that they went to in their free time. It's not preserving the memory of that. And it's not preserving the ethnic heritage of many of the people here in the city. And so that's one thing we really, to us these days in the 21st century, those are kind of, that's why we exist as a museum, because this is a fun, interesting city that it's fun to visit today. It's fun to meet people around here because there's so many different people that you see that have different stories in their lives. And you want to be able to tell those stories. You want to be able to tell you want to be able to both preserve the bad memories and the good.
Right. You don't want to just preserve one side of history, or just the good parts of it. Just
yes.
Not all history is great. So a lot of it's pretty bad, but you can't just throw it away.
Yeah, and you want to. This is just it's such a thoroughly thick, complex, and hard to describe city that, it's.
That's what I've gotten so far.
Yeah, and it's because, it's everything from the fact that it's multiple communities merged into one, multiple ethnicities merged into one. You have ethnic communities forming here very early on. Like, in our long-range plans, I think we'd like to get into this general idea of how diverse and amazing the immigration story is, because you have, the 1840s and you have this German ethnic community setting up on the east side of the city, setting up, churches over there. St. Alphonsus Church, which is today by far the biggest church on the east side, is its roots date back to the 1840s as a German church over there, and it's there's old postcards of it that say Greenfield, instead of Dearborn, because it was at one point where it was set up, it was Greenfield Township, and then it became Springwells Township. It's this long-running established, you have this long-running ethnic community that's there even before the Fort Rouge plant is built in this area. On this side of town, you have these immigrant communities coming from Scotland, from Ireland, basically, one thing we probably should talk about here is Henry Ford. He was born in 1863 at roughly the corner of Ford and Greenfield Road, and he was kind of in one of those ethnic communities. His family, the Fords, came from Ireland. They immigrated through Canada. Originally, his family kind of settled more in the Redford area, but they came down and joined the rest of the Fords in the Scotch Settlement. And they were, Scotch Settlement is... It basically, it's a couple streets around Warren and Ford Road, near Greenfield, that general area. It's Irish and Scottish immigrants, as I said before. And Ford went to Scotch Settlement School. He went to also nearby, there was a Miller School. And he experienced farm life in that area. He grew up as a farmer. It wasn't a great life. His father was reasonably prosperous. His father, William Ford, who owned his birthplace there. Ford could have been a prosperous farmer if he wanted to, but he ends up going off to Detroit, taking a lot of mechanical jobs, working for Detroit, what became Detroit Edison. He starts working on cars. At one point, he comes back briefly to Dearborn. This is a funny little story, but in the 1880s, he comes back to Dearborn area briefly and sets up a sawmill. And going back to the story of this house, when the Rosses were actually built, turning the powder magazine into a house, they actually used lumber from Henry Ford's sawmill. Like we have in our collection, we have these receipts for like the lumber that they're using from the Henry Ford sawmill. But it gets even better. There's evidence in our paperwork that suggests they stiffed Henry Ford. They didn't actually pay Henry Ford for the lumber, Yeah, and there's paperwork that says like we have the receipt and like work for it, and basically there's future letters from Ford saying, you didn't pay me, you owe me money, and like effectively collection agency sort of correspondence, and then like there's from Lizzie Ross, she's writing back saying, I don't owe you a cent. Like we don't, this lumber agreement is not true. We don't owe you any money for it. So there's, like I said, we may be missing part of the story, but it's we suspect that the Rosses may have actually stiffed Henry Ford at this point, at that point in the 1880s. So it's kind of, like I said, it's kind of a fun story. The thing is, where he grew up, it was a rural area. And Scotch Settlement, it was basically kind of a cluster of houses. It wasn't a real community. He viewed himself as a Dearborn native because Dearborn was the closest village. And it played a big reason when you get later into the 20th century, when when communities merge here. A big reason why the Dearborn name survived is because Henry Ford viewed himself as a Dearborn native, and he's able to say, "I want the Dearborn name to live on." Pretty much, despite the fact that the majority of people at the time were not living in the old village of Dearborn.
All right, so I want to get back in gear with the artifacts of the museum, and this one's kind of special because it was a missing artifact, as the Detroit Free Press reported. Let's take a few minutes and talk about the Powderhorn. Can you tell us about who owned it, what it was, how it went missing, how it was retrieved, and kind of that whole story?
So the famous Nowlin Powderhorn was made in the 1750s in New Hampshire. It was made for and owned by the grandfather of one of the early Dearborn families, the Nowlins. It was existing in the French and Indian War period in the American Revolution, and when the Nowlin family came from New York State via the Erie Canal to Michigan, they brought it with them. It was a cherished family heirloom here. And the Nowlins, it's an important artifact because the Nowlins were kind of one of that early generation of families that came to Dearborn here when the arsenal opened. And they wrote their memories all down. A guy, the son of the family, William Nowlin, who was fairly young in the 1830s, in 1876 wrote this book called The Bar-Covered House, which is really the only book that talks about 1830s Dearborn. He was also fairly prominent in the community and, got around. And the thing is, the Nowlin Powderhorn has cultural significance mostly because of his book. Because, how it is sometimes, whoever actually writes the history is the one who, makes it. The thing is, the Nowlins actually, the Nowlins, because not Mr. William Nowlin actually wrote down the history, in retrospect, he made his family more important by doing that. And because it's a great piece from the 1750s, it's beautiful as you look at it. And it was something that, Detroit was the Detroit Historical Museum was able to acquire the artifact in 1947. And it's something, because of the connection of the Nowlin family immigrating here in the 1830s, we wanted to have it on display at some point. Mm-hmm. And so when the Commandant's Quarters opens as a museum in 1950, they do a series of rotating exhibits, and one of their early ones in 52 was one called something like the Saga of a Settler. And it's a lot of kind of early pioneer-related artifacts, everything from models of wagons to guns to other items. And really, one of the prize items is on loan from Detroit is this Nowlin Powderhorn. So it's on display for a limited period, and it's, the exhibit is finally completed. The Powderhorn is put into storage, and then one day the Powderhorn just disappears.
No one really, it's not really clear who or why, or
it's not really clear. I mean, it
just wasn't there all of a sudden.
They go into the cabinet, it's just not there. It's also, it's notable to point out too that in addition to the museum and the building, the police still also had a presence in the building, and it was rather notable later as investigations were going on that the initial police report has not been located. So it's suspicious. So, for decades, it was kind of this big museum mystery. Who took the Powderhorn? Was it staff? Was it police? Was it whoever? And there was some breaks. Eventually, it was found at a Christie's auction. It was spotted there. Nobody at the time, we couldn't really get anybody to follow the leads and track it down.
Where was this auction at?
It was a Christie's auction in New York.
Okay.
But the thing is, from there, the point is they were able to track it down from that point. Is the issue, because the investigation started only a few years ago. Again, it restarted. It ran through the Dearborn police. They got involved with the FBI. The FBI art theft division. There's apparently an FBI art theft division.
I didn't know there was until I read the Free Press article. And
I didn't either.
Because I thought only... I know Italy actually does have a kind of form of an art police.
Yeah.
I read about it in a book called Chasing Aphrodite, which is more about J. Paul Getty,
sure.
The Malibu, all that stuff. But anyway, Italy has a form of art police to protect and preserve and stop art theft, because there's a lot in Italy, because Italy literally bleeds culture. There's Roman pottery, there's older Italian kingdom pieces of artwork buried underwater. In people's backyards, if they're digging, they may come across ancient artifacts just in their backyard.
Well,
so I chuckled when I found out that the FBI has an art division.
It's not surprising that that they were also apparently based on the East Coast. I think it was Philadelphia, if I remember right, is where this art division was based. So yeah, it makes sense there. But they, with their help, they were able to track it down. They found it, basically, a guy they originally questioned. It turns out he was lying, and then he dies, and then the item ends up in another sale. But because it was already flagged, when it ended up in that sale, the FBI was notified, and that's how the Powderhorn came back. But because the item was on loan from Detroit to us for the display, Detroit is the one who ends up getting it. And from what I understand, Detroit either has it on display now or will be having it on display soon for the next few months.
Hey Michiganders, thanks for watching. That concludes part 1 in this episode. Tune in March to see part 2.